Looking at the matter of giving, speaking about our weekly contribution, we spoke at some length last week with regard to why there is more said in the New Testament with regard to this aspect of worship than there is all the others, or any of the others, and almost all of the others combined. There's actually very little text concerning the Lord's Supper. There are the three instances in the New Testament in the Gospels where it's instituted, and then it's mentioned in Acts 2. It's mentioned in Acts 20, and so there's not a ton of text there, but the Bible has quite a bit to say about our giving. In fact, there are 2 entire chapters dedicated to that matter here in 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Of course, there are other texts as well. 1 Timothy 6 commands those who are rich in this world to be ready to share, and other similar texts. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Acts 20 and verse number 35. But with respect to just some of the passages that are important for us with regard to our giving, and the first is that I want to mention is in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse number 12. Now, in the context, what Paul is talking about is that the church in Corinth, or the churches in Achaia, had, for lack of a better term, made a pledge to give. And Paul is reminding them of their earlier commitment to give. And he opens chapter 8 with an account concerning the Macedonians and how they had given, even out of their abundant poverty, they had given even beyond their ability. And then noted that they were able to do so because they had first given themselves to the Lord. It reminds me of the passage in 1 Corinthians 16 and about verse 15 where Paul writes about Aquila and Priscilla that they have addicted themselves to the work of the ministry. In other words, they had completely dedicated themselves to the work of the ministry. They were. And so our giving in many cases will also reflect our commitment to the local work. But in this particular case, Paul is talking about that they had made a pledge to give, and he was reminding them of that. And it goes all the way back into 1 Corinthians 16, where he told them how to do it, to give on the first day of every week as God had prospered them. And so then in verse 12, he says, if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. And then he also goes on in verses 13 and 14. He says, for I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be an equality. And one thing that Paul was reminding these brethren of is the fact that this pledge to assist the brethren back in Judea, because there were needy saints in Judea, that was the primary impetus behind this particular giving effort. But what he was reminding them was that the brethren in Judea were responsible for sending the preachers over there to preach the gospel to them. In other words, they supported us when we left out from there and came here to preach to you. And so now, so they had the gospel and the means to send people, and they did it. And now you have the means to financially assist them in their time of need. And so that's what he's talking about here. That the brethren in Corinth, in a way, owed a debt to the churches in Judea, because they had sent out Paul and Barnabas and Silas and John Mark and others, and so he's showing them that there's a balance here. When you were in need, they helped you. Now they are in need, and you can help them. And there is, he says, uses the term an equality. And then he goes down into verse 24 of chapter 8. And he says, therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. So we understand that our giving is an expression, or is one expression of our love for the Lord. And we talked about this in some detail, or at least in passing, about we've just come out of the Christmas season. And a lot of people spend a lot of money at Christmas, and particularly on their kids or on their grandkids, or maybe on your spouse, and those gifts or whatever is either given in time or in money is an expression of a person's love. It doesn't mean you have to buy the best gift, because sometimes you might do something for someone, you might make something for someone. And that is a proof of your love. And Paul uses that as an example in regard to our giving. And then in verse number 5 of chapter 9, he says, I thought it necessary. Well, let me go in verse number 3. He says, yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, and not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. In other words, Paul said, we don't need to get there, and y'all haven't kept your pledge. You haven't kept your word. You see, it'd be embarrassing for us because we've bragged on you, but just think how embarrassing it'd be for you. It'd be embarrassing for us. He goes, and also yourselves there in verse 4. He says, therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. In other words, to put something off until the last minute, and then, for example, just as a very minor example, we've talked about, or we've done this through the years, what we call our Christmas tithe. And look, the Christmas tithe really doesn't put anybody out. It's just something that we do that reminds us that we've been blessed, and that we need to think about others that are less fortunate than we are. But to set aside 1% of what we spend on Christmas every month is not a burden. Is not a burden. All right? And probably it wouldn't be a burden if somebody forgot to put aside that 1% through the month and then get to December and have to make it all up at once. But what if you'd made a significant promise? For example, let's say that you'd made a significant promise to give, say, 10% of all your income over the course of a year. And you had the opportunity each week to set aside, say 10% each week, and then you get to the end and it's all there. But how hard would it be if you didn't set any aside through the course of the year? And then all of a sudden, for lack of a better term, and this is not right, but you understand, the bill comes due. The pledge comes due. And then all of a sudden, in order to keep your word, you got to scramble around and come up with all that money that you should have been setting aside every week. And you got to come up with it, at the 1st of December. You're probably not going to be as happy about giving it as if you had given all along, like had been promised and like Paul had commanded. Lay aside, Paul saying, do this every week so that there's no gatherings when I come. Because if I put this off, then I get to the end and I got to keep my word. Then I don't give with the right attitude, and that's what Paul's talking about in this particular case. Don't get to the end and then just do what you promised because, well, I promised I'd do it, And the whole mindset, the whole heart is not what it should be. And then he goes into verse 6. He says, "But this I say, that he who sows sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall reap also bountifully." Now, this is just a principle that we all understand. In any, of course, it's an agricultural illustration. But if you want to, let's just say you build a house or you redo your front lawn or whatever, and you're going to plant seed, you're not going to use, for example, half of the rate that's recommended. If you're like me, and let's just say it called for let's just say it called for 50 pounds of seed every 5,000 square feet. Now, I'm just pulling numbers out there, all right? If it calls for 50 pounds of seed every 5,000 square feet, I'm probably going to go about 70 or 75. Even though it's probably not necessary because those people that do that know what they're doing, right? But I'm going to go a little heavier than the recommended rate. But I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to go 25 when the recommended rate is 50. Because I know that however much seed I plant is going to equal the amount of grass that I'm able to grow. And I don't want my front yard to look like a dog with a mange. I want that thing to look like a husky or a Pyrenees. I want that thing covered up in grass, right? And so Paul is talking about sowing and reaping, and we all understand that the more you sow, the more you reap. It reminds me, 2 years ago, Brett planted corn behind the house, and he planted it so tight it looked like the stalks were almost touching. I don't mean the ears and the leaves. I'm talking about it looked like it looked almost like a jail cell. The stalks were so close together, and everything worked out that year. He got all the rain he needed at the right time, and he had a bumper crop. What he could have done was, I think I'm going to go about half. And what would he lost? He would have lost, a lot of fruit because he sowed sparingly as opposed to bountifully. Then also the word bountifully is of significance because it comes from the word eulogia or eulogos. It's a prefix and a word. The prefix is the letters eu, which is in the Greek means good. And then the word logos is the word for word. And so the word, and again, I'm not saying, I'm just simply giving you the root of the word because the word means bountifully. But the point is, it comes from this idea of sowing a good word. He who sows bountifully shall reap also bountifully. And this, by the way, that's the word we get our word eulogy from. And what is a eulogy? In our day and time, what is a eulogy? Yeah, you speak. It's in our day and time. You speak well of the dead, right? You highlight their achievements. You highlight their good characteristics. You share pleasant memories and encourage people to follow those types of things. Well, that's the word here. It's the word we get. Again, it's changed in form, but it's become eulogy is a good word. It's what it literally means. And so Paul here says that our giving should be a good word. Our giving should be a good word on behalf of what we believe and teach and practice. And then verse 7 says, so let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly nor of necessity, where there's compulsion. And we just talked about that compulsion aspect, in not keeping up with one's pledge. He says, not grudgingly nor of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so our giving is with purpose. In other words, it's based on our prosperity, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, but it's also that we give with purpose. We have determined beforehand, what we're going to give. Now, we don't scramble around on Sunday morning thumbing through our wallet or whatever. It's a matter that has been well thought through. And so that's purposeful giving. It says we are to give as we purpose in our heart, again, not out of grudging necessity or out of compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Then in verses 8 through 10, Paul says that our giving also increases God's blessing upon us. Now look, this is not televangelism, give me a seed gift and God's going to put money in your bank account. That's not what's under consideration here. But people who put God to the test in their giving never complain that they don't have enough. I've never heard any person that was a good giver, a generous giver, tell me that they ever lacked anything. And that's what Paul's talking about here in verse 8. God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. And in verse 10, he talks about he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. Now, there are two things involved here. Number one, there is the blessing that we receive from being generous givers. But then there's also the blessings that others receive from us being generous givers. And Paul highlights that starting in verse 11 through verse 15. And what he makes mention of is that through this generous giving that's already been accomplished, that the needs of the brethren in Judea have been met, at least for the time being. But not only the needs of the brethren have been met, but the church is also helping take care of other people who are in need. By the way, and that's the divine order. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, but especially those of the household of faith. Galatians 6 and verse 10. So our first and foremost responsibility is to take care of Christians who are in need. Not to the exclusion of non-Christians, but when our brethren are cared for, then we're at liberty to go and take care of others. And Paul says this. He says in verse number 12, talking about their liberality, in verse 11, for the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but is also abounding through many thanksgivings to God, while through the proof of this ministry they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ, for your liberal sharing with them and with all men. In other words, them is the saints. I mean, them has to, them is a plural pronoun, has to agree with its nearest antecedent noun that matches up to it. And that's the saints. Paul says your giving has not only met the needs of the saints, it's met the needs of all men. And so there's the blessings that we receive from being generous givers. There's the blessings that brethren receive from us being generous givers. And then there's the blessings that non-Christians receive from us being more blessed to give than to receive. Acts 20:35. And so then verse 14 says, by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. And so I think we can infer from this that the church grew because of the liberality of the brethren who were helping those in Judea. Not the Christians in Judea, but then giving and helping even beyond that. And by the way, one would not necessarily have to be a recipient of that gift to appreciate it. Does that make sense? Let's say, for example, let's just say, now Kyle, you're an infidel, all right? Kyle's an infidel, all right? And he lives out here. And he lives close to somebody who's a member of the church. All right? And something bad befalls the family that lives close to him. Maybe the husband loses his job and the wife gets sick. Then all of a sudden, what does he see? He sees a continuous stream of people day after day coming and taking care of his neighbor. That, his electricity doesn't get turned off. His water doesn't get turned off. There's food and more than is necessary. So what does Kyle understand? Being a Christian means something. At least it means something to these people. It's like, what would happen to me if I was in that shape? Do I have a family? Do I have a spiritual family, a support system that's going to make sure that me and my family eat? That my lights stay on, that my water stays turned on? That my bills are paid or whatever. Do I have that? And it's like, I might want some of that. Which is the very essence, and I don't want to say too much about it here because I intend it's in the sermon this morning. But that's Matthew 5:13. Letting your light so shine before men that they see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. 2 Corinthians 9:11-15 is that. It's Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount in action among the churches of Macedonia, Achaia, and in Judea. And so the text is very explicit in a lot of ways. But again, the one area wherein it is not explicit is in how much. The Bible, for the New Testament, the Bible, or I should say, the New Testament never dictates a specific amount that is to be given. It never dictates a specific amount that's to be given. That's at the top of 33. And I mentioned this last week, that the reason why that is the case is because if that number, if there was a number or a percentage, then I wouldn't feel obligated to do any more. I wouldn't do any less than that, but I certainly wouldn't do any more than that because I've fulfilled my obligation. I've checked that box. And so God never, there's no New Testament text that binds tithing on the Christian. But there is a principle. There's a principle of tithing that's found even before the law of Moses. Abraham gave a tithe of all that he gained in that war against in the five, when Lot and his company were taken, and Abraham took 317 men and rescued Lot and grabbed a great spoil, and Melchizedek, who was both a king and priest, met him. And the Bible says Abraham gave him a tithe of all. Gave him a tenth. And you can also see in Abraham's lineage, again, this is well before the law of Moses, where Jacob gave a tithe. He gave a tenth. And that's kind of a benchmark, so to speak. It's not to say that that's all they gave, but when it did speak in those numbers, a tenth was the number. Now that number, again, doesn't appear for us as Christians, but there is, I think, some principle involved in it. So you wouldn't want to bind it. We live in various cultural systems For example, Abraham never paid federal income taxes. There are a lot of different things, but in that regard, the Jews did pay taxes to the king. And it did not relieve them of their obligation to give of the first fruits. You remember, Solomon didn't just he didn't just conjure up all the money to build the temple and put all that gold in and around and covering up the temple. That money came from the people. And then when Solomon died and they left it to Rehoboam, and Rehoboam's not sure what he's going to do with regard to the people. And the old men say, look, man, your dad taxed us to death. He taxed us to death. If you'll lighten the load on them a little bit, they'll love you. And that's not exactly what they said, but said they'll follow you to the jumping off place. So he took that advice and he mulled it over, and then he went and talked to his young friends, and they said, go tell the people that if you thought my dad's taxes were heavy, said his was a little finger compared to my thigh. And that's the advice that he accepted, and 10 of the 12 tribes left. And Jeroboam became king over the 10 tribes. But the point is, the people were still obligated to give despite whatever taxes were required of them. That was the very thing, by the way, that Samuel told the people. We want a king. He said, look, if you get a king, he's going to tax you to death. He's going to take the best of all that you have, but you still have your obligation to God. Just because you got a king doesn't mean you're still not obligated to God. And so there are a lot of different systems that people live under. So I think that's also important to understand why there's not a specified amount. But there is the principle of the tenth that is found well ahead of the Mosaic command to tithe. Again, and tithing was not all that they did. We enumerated some of those things last week. Any questions, thoughts, or comments on that? All right, we're going to move into day 21 on the music that pleases God. And specifically, we're looking at the matter of our singing. Looking at the matter of our singing as a part of our worship. Now, on the top of that right hand section, right underneath the heading, it says vocal music has a threefold purpose. It praises God. It is an outlet for our spiritual emotions. And then what? What does it do? It teaches and admonishes others. And that's found in two separate texts. It's found in Ephesians 5 and verse 19. And it's found in Colossians 3 and verse 16. Now, the second one there about the spiritual emotions is mentioned here in the next paragraph. It says, is anyone happy? Let him sing. Let him sing. Now, the point is not just to sing anything, but to sing praise to God. If you're happy, when you're happy, you sing praises. You sing praises to God. And I like what's said here at the end of this first paragraph. Whether you have a good voice or not, whether you've been trained in music or not, sing out to the glory of God. The Bible never says that we have to sing well. It says we sing with the Spirit, we sing with the understanding. But also, I think that one aspect we miss on this is that our singing is also described as praise. It's praise. It's the fruit of our lips. Now, let me ask you something. When you hear, just a word association, so to speak, if you hear the word praise, do you think loud or quiet? Loud, right? Loud. Somebody makes a basket at the last second and your team wins and they get praised. They get a golf clap. Is that what they get? Get a golf clap? Way to go. Good job. No, they don't get that. Somebody scores a touchdown to win the football game. They just is all they get is one of these? Is that all they get? No, look, I'm not saying we have to create some type of arena or stadium scenario or environment, but the point is that our singing is praise. It's praise. That is one of the things that always impressed me and really, really encouraged me when I was in Ghana. Is, man, them people sing. My goodness, they sing. And the same as in Kenya. We found the same thing in Kenya. But man, the Ghanaians, man, they will tear the roof. You put 500 Ghanaians in one of those concrete buildings, and you think that thing's fixing to come apart. I mean, but they are some singing folks. And they are not afraid to turn it out. And sometimes we are good to do that, but many times we are not. For example, I think as a general rule, we probably sing better in the fellowship building than we do in this building. I don't know if it's because of the occasion that when we're in that fellowship building, we're there for the purpose of singing. Obviously, I think the acoustics are better in that, which enhances not the singing, but the environment itself. I think perhaps there's also the sense of proximity, that we're in that building, we're closer to one another, and it's easier, or we are less self-conscious. We are less self-conscious about singing when we are in a group, in the midst of a group of people who are singing, as opposed to being isolated here or there or somewhere out on the back 40. Nobody's fixing to bust it out if they're the only person singing loud and they're in the back corner somewhere or the front corner somewhere. Why? Because you feel isolated. You feel like the attention's being drawn to you, and so. But singing by its very nature is praise. It's praise.
I know when I visit different congregations, I don't know if I should or not, but if they have good singing, to me, in my heart, it reflects what kind of congregation.
Absolutely. When you go other places and when you hear people sing, it's just it is very encouraging. By the way, that's also true here. When the singing is what it ought to be when we're here in this. I say us are here in this place. It's encouraging. It's encouraging. I'm going to tell y'all this story. When I was at East Wood Street in Paris, it was actually in my job description. That I was not only the associate minister, but I was also the song leader. So I did all the song leading for the congregation. And we had somewhere between 380 and 450 people on any given Sunday. And our singing was not only tape delayed and broadcast on TV 1 week after the fact, it was also broadcast live over the radio. And I was leading singing one morning, and I can still remember the song. I won't tell you which one it was, but I was leading the singing. There had to be at least 400 people there. And it sounded like there was about 35 cadavers in that building. It was the most pathetic display I ever heard in my whole life. And it was supposed to be the song right before the sermon. It was so bad after the first verse, I just cut it off and sat down. It was, to quote Nate Oates, it was disgusting. It was disgusting. That 400 people could, and by the way, this is not 400 people in Coleman Coliseum. This is 400 people in a building that seats about 550 to 600 people max. And it was just, I cut it off, number one, because I was mad. And number two, it was an embarrassment to anybody listening to it on the radio. I mean, it was that bad. Why? Well, that's okay. I'll accept that. I mean, good singing generally requires a good leader. And by the way, there is Bible for that from the Old Testament. That not just anybody was permitted to lead singing in the temple. That God appointed certain men to do the song leading and I would assume to train others to do the same. So if you don't have a good leader, yes, it makes it difficult. Just because we're almost done, I'm going to talk. Let me talk just a little bit about that in more of a technical aspect, and we'll come back, Lord willing, next week and talking more about the biblical aspect. Is that one area that we could improve is learning how to sing and follow a song leader. Because, and this is not just true here, this is true almost everywhere, is that people, is that the first or second? First, okay. That people are voice followers rather than leader followers. All right, for example, if I'm leading singing, and I'm beating, of course, I keep time, whatnot, as I'm leading. Right? If I stop singing, it should not affect the singing. Because if I'm still keeping time and you're watching me, if you're watching me, then you should be able to keep time and continue to sing without me singing. Right? But see, when we're voice led, we're following the song leader's voice as opposed to his conducting of the singing. Then when the song leader falls out, everybody falls out. Because now all of a sudden the song leader's voice is not coming over the top of everybody else's, and then all of a sudden you're hearing yourself, and then all of a sudden you're self-conscious about it. But as long as I'm up there hammering away, you're good to go. Right? But if I fall out, all of a sudden I can hear myself a little bit better, and I'm self-conscious about it. But it shouldn't be that way. And not only should the singing continue, it should continue at tempo. It should continue at tempo. But what's going to happen 99 times out of 4? It's going to slow down. Every time it's going to slow down. And when it slows down, it gets lower. The key drops. Right? So if you have a limited number of, for example, you have a limited number of bass singers, and most songs are probably written at about the bottom end of their range. And by the time the church has drug this thing down about a half step or 2 half steps or 3 half steps, you've run the basses out of their range. They can't sing down there. And sometimes that's also true for the altos, because some of the alto lines are written in that middle range in between the clefs. And you drop that thing down a note or 2, and you run your altos out of their range. And so, singing is something we need to work on. Because, look, the better we know how to do something, the better we will do it. And the better that we do it, the more encouraging it will be. Is that right? All right. So, but yeah, Kathy, I agree. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue with you about that, because that's absolutely true. Songs have to be. Ma'am? Oh yeah. Well, and we had more than one in the last 4 or 5 years, and well, you remember Amber's husband. Ryan. Yeah.
When I was young, which is nearly 100 years ago, they would always hire a teacher to come and teach music.
Oh, have singing school. Have singing schools.
It did help a lot.
They had a singing school not long ago at Oak Grove, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know how many people went. I don't even know who conducted it. Yeah, and by the way, that's not good. And I don't mean just because of that individual. There are other people that I know have known through the years that are the same way. But there needs to be a happy medium somewhere. Needs to be a happy medium somewhere. All right, now next, Lord willing, next Sunday we're going to look at bottom of page or the bottom half of the lesson on page 21. And we're going to talk about some things, biblically speaking, about what. I'm sorry, day 21. Day 21. We'll finish up on the bottom half of that, moving over, but we'll talk about some things that are not in the text with regard to our singing.